Someone captured the moment on camera, standing just outside Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, one of the most heavily fortified American military installations anywhere in the Middle East. A bystander pointed a phone toward the sky and recorded what unfolded next. A missile struck, not near the base, not somewhere along the perimeter. It was a direct impact. The footage is so catastrophic, so total in its destruction, that when it first began circulating online, millions dismissed it as artificial. People assumed it had to be AI generated, a digital simulation, perhaps a special effect from some elaborate propaganda video. But it was real. What the world saw in that footage appears to be the most devastating strike on an American military installation since the Beirut barracks bombing of 1983. And perhaps most striking of all, the advanced American defense systems stationed at that very base. Systems worth billions of dollars and representing the most sophisticated air defense technology the United States has deployed did nothing to stop it. They didn't slow the missile. They didn't deflect it. They didn't intercept it. In fact, they didn't detect it early enough to mount any meaningful response. It simply struck its target. Now consider what exists inside a base like Prince Sultan. American personnel, aircraft, command centers, communications networks, the physical infrastructure that allows U.S. military power to operate across the Gulf. Somewhere between what Iranian officials claim happened and what Washington is prepared to acknowledge publicly lies the uncomfortable question of casualties. Numbers the Pentagon has yet to fully explain to the American public, because the physics of such an impact tells its own story. A direct missile strike on a fully operational military base does not normally produce single-digit casualties. The scale of the explosion seen in the footage makes that outcome extremely difficult to reconcile with the official figures released so far. Those numbers would only make sense if the base had been nearly empty at the moment of impact. Yet there is no evidence that it was. This is precisely why analysts continue to scrutinize the footage frame by frame. It is also the sort of scenario former U.S. intelligence officer Scott Ritter warned about long before the conflict escalated. Ritter argued repeatedly that a direct confrontation with Iran would inevitably place American bases across the Gulf within missile range. His warning was blunt. If a war began, those installations would be hit, and American defensive systems would struggle to respond quickly enough to prevent serious damage. His predictions were controversial. His views were heavily criticized, and in some cases he was pushed out of major media platforms that shape public debate in the United States. But his central argument, that Iranian missile capabilities had advanced significantly, has now returned to the center of discussion following the strike on Prince Sultan Air Base. What makes this moment particularly significant is the context surrounding it. The conflict has already seen several escalations: the withdrawal of a carrier group from a contested zone, the destruction of a THAAD radar installation, and missile strikes reaching deep into Israeli territory. Yet according to Iranian officials, those actions were only the opening phase. Iran has publicly suggested that the weapons used earlier in the conflict were largely older systems, relatively inexpensive drones, and earlier generation missiles. Many of them cost only a few $1,000s to produce. Their strategic role, according to Iranian statements and some independent analysts, was to overwhelm and exhaust American air defense networks, flood the radar screens, force defenders to launch expensive interceptors, drain the stockpiles that take years to replenish. In other words, the initial wave was designed not primarily to destroy targets, but to wear down the defensive shield protecting them. If that assessment is accurate, then the strike on Prince Sultan may represent a transition into a second phase. Iranian officials have hinted that more advanced missile systems, those previously held in reserve, are now entering operational use. These are weapons designed specifically to challenge degraded air defense networks. The timing is notable. Reports suggest that interceptor supplies across several regional bases have been stretched thin. Radar systems have faced repeated strain from continuous tracking operations. Crews have been operating for weeks under near constant alert conditions. In military terms, fatigue and equipment depletion can become as consequential as the weapons themselves. At the same time, the economic consequences of the conflict are already being felt globally. Oil prices have climbed sharply, recently touching $93 per barrel, the highest level recorded since 2023. Energy analysts caution that this figure may not represent the peak, but merely a waypoint. The issue is not simply market speculation. Gulf oil storage facilities are reportedly approaching capacity, while shipping routes remain under pressure from security concerns. If production continues while exports slow, producers may have little choice but to reduce output. Such reductions, especially if they occur simultaneously across several major exporters, can move global markets quickly. 2 weeks ago, analysts warned of a 14-day window before storage capacity constraints would begin affecting production decisions. That window is now closing. Critics argue that warnings about this scenario were delivered long before the first missiles were fired. Several military analysts and former officials reportedly cautioned policymakers that a war with Iran would be extremely difficult to control once underway. They argued that the network of American bases across the Gulf, while strategically valuable, would also become obvious targets in the event of a direct confrontation. Despite those warnings, the conflict escalated. Now Prince Sultan Air Base has been struck, and the images of the explosion have circulated across the world. Statements made earlier in the crisis are also being revisited. Some American officials suggested that U.S. forces would operate comfortably within range of Iranian territory, confident that their defensive systems could intercept any incoming threats. Those remarks reflected a long-standing assumption in Washington that technological superiority would provide a decisive advantage. Yet the events surrounding this strike raise questions about whether that assumption still holds in the same way it once did. The broader strategic reality, according to several analysts, is that Iran appears to be conducting its campaign in distinct stages. The first stage focused on exhausting expensive defense systems through repeated low-cost attacks. By many accounts, that phase achieved at least part of its objective. The second stage, now emerging, involves the use of more advanced weapons aimed directly at critical infrastructure within the regional military network. Targets are no longer symbolic, but operational. Air bases, radar facilities, and command systems that enable coordinated military action. And there is already speculation about a possible third stage. Iranian officials have hinted at cyber operations targeting infrastructure beyond the battlefield itself, power grids, water systems, and financial networks. If such actions were ever attempted, the conflict would no longer be confined to the Middle East. It would reach directly into the domestic systems of the United States and its allies. For now, however, the focus remains on the immediate consequences of the Prince Sultan strike and what it reveals about the evolving dynamics of the conflict. One fact is already clear. The Gulf states themselves are now deeply entangled in a war that places their territory squarely within the operational map. Countries such as Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain all host American military installations. For decades, those bases were presented as a guarantee of security. Today, they have become potential targets. Every one of those countries hosts American military bases on its territory. For decades, their governments were assured that those installations represented security, an extension of American protection in an unstable region. Yet what they are experiencing now tells a rather different story. The bases themselves have become targets. And because they sit within their borders, their airports, oil facilities, civilian infrastructure, and ordinary citizens are now caught in the blast radius of a conflict they neither started nor have the power to end. The Gulf states also face a growing economic dilemma. Oil production continues, but shipping routes have become uncertain and storage capacity is rapidly filling. If producers cannot export their output, they are forced to consider production cuts. And when those cuts occur simultaneously across several major suppliers, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, the effect on global markets can be immediate. Oil prices rarely rise gradually under those conditions. They surge, and those surges ripple outward across the global economy, into the cost of manufacturing, food transport, heating bills, and airline tickets. The recent climb to $93 a barrel is already raising alarm among economists. Some analysts are openly discussing scenarios in which prices could approach $150 if supply restrictions intensify in the coming weeks. For historical context, the oil shocks of the 1970s, events that triggered a decade of stagflation, reshaped energy markets, and toppled political careers throughout the Western world, peaked at roughly $50 in today's adjusted terms. By comparison, The current trajectory has already surpassed that threshold, and the largest production cuts have not yet arrived. At the same time, Washington has accused China and Russia of supporting Iran through intelligence and weapons technology. Yet critics abroad are quick to point out that the United States itself has long supplied Israel with vast quantities of military assistance, including thousands of munitions and billions of dollars in aid. To many countries observing the conflict, the debate over moral authority has become increasingly complicated. Across what is often described as the Global South, the regions that purchase Gulf energy and depend on stable trade routes, governments are quietly calculating where their interests lie. The answer is not necessarily aligning with Washington's expectations. Beijing appears calm. Moscow shows little sign of concern. Both countries are watching closely as the United States commits financial resources, diplomatic capital, and military assets to the confrontation. Their approach reflects a longer strategic timeline. Patience, after all, can be as powerful a strategy as direct intervention. Domestic politics in the United States may ultimately shape the trajectory of the conflict just as much as events on the battlefield. When the war in Afghanistan began, public support among Americans exceeded 90%. Today, polling indicates that roughly 90% of Americans oppose the present conflict. That reversal is remarkable. It suggests that public patience for prolonged overseas wars has eroded dramatically since the early 2000s. Afghanistan took 2 decades to exhaust American political will. Vietnam required roughly 10 years. This confrontation appears to be eroding support within a matter of weeks. The explanation is largely economic. Previous wars did not immediately affect everyday household costs in the United States. Gasoline prices during the Vietnam era remained relatively stable. The war in Afghanistan did not threaten to push grocery bills or transport costs sharply upward. By contrast, the current conflict intersects directly with global energy markets. When oil prices rise, American consumers feel the effect almost instantly. Every surge at the pump becomes a reminder of the conflict's consequences. Every fluctuation in financial markets reinforces the sense that the war carries a price tag extending far beyond the battlefield. If public opposition already approaches 90% after a few weeks of fighting, analysts are asking what that figure might look like after several months of sustained energy price increases. A prolonged period of oil above $120 a barrel would almost certainly intensify the political pressure. Looking at the broader strategic picture, the conflict has already produced outcomes that many observers consider historically significant. Iran entered this confrontation as a country under decades of sanctions, an economy isolated from much of the Western financial system, its currency weakened, and its leadership frequently targeted by covert operations. Yet through the course of this crisis, Tehran has demonstrated a strategy designed to exploit structural weaknesses in the systems surrounding American power. One lesson is that missile defense networks, even sophisticated ones, can be strained through sustained attrition. By launching large numbers of inexpensive drones and missiles, an attacker can force defenders to expend extremely costly interceptors. Over time, the economic imbalance begins to matter as much as the military one. Another lesson concerns the foundations of American economic influence. Much of the global financial system still revolves around energy markets linked to the dollar. If oil trade patterns shift, even gradually, toward alternative arrangements, the long-term implications could extend far beyond the Middle East. There are also signs that traditional alliances are under strain. The Gulf states, long regarded as dependable American partners, are now reassessing the risks of hosting large foreign military installations. Some have reportedly reduced investment commitments or begun quiet discussions about alternative security arrangements. Whether those discussions lead to concrete policy changes remains to be seen. But the fact that they are happening at all indicates a degree of uncertainty that would have been difficult to imagine only a few years ago. Meanwhile, the perception of American credibility has taken a visible hit in the eyes of many international observers. Images of a U.S. carrier withdrawing from contested waters, the destruction of a billion-dollar radar system in Jordan, and the strike on Prince Sultan Air Base have circulated globally. Each incident contributes to a broader narrative about shifting balances of power. None of this means the conflict's outcome is predetermined. Military, economic, and political dynamics remain fluid. Yet it is increasingly clear that the regional order emerging from this crisis may look very different from the one that existed before it. In such a scenario, China could deepen its role as a primary economic partner for Gulf states seeking diversified alliances. Russia might expand its influence in global energy negotiations, particularly with European countries that have repeatedly confronted the consequences of energy dependency. Iran, regardless of how the fighting eventually concludes, may well emerge having demonstrated that it cannot easily be forced into submission through sanctions or airstrikes alone. The petrodollar system, long a central pillar of global finance, may not disappear, but it could weaken gradually if energy exporters decide to diversify their trade arrangements. Such changes tend to occur slowly, but once the direction shifts, it is difficult to reverse. Amid all of this geopolitical maneuvering, it is often ordinary people who must adapt first. Workers across South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa have built their livelihoods around the stability of Gulf economies. Any prolonged disruption forces them to adjust quickly, finding new opportunities, rebuilding supply chains, and navigating economic uncertainty. History shows that populations are remarkably resilient, even when the political systems governing them fail to anticipate crises. What history also records, however, is the legacy of leaders who pursued wars long after the strategic warnings became clear. Analysts, military officials, and political advisors have all offered cautions at various stages of this confrontation. Yet the conflict escalated nonetheless. Now the images from Prince Sultan Air Base have traveled around the world. Advanced missiles are entering the field. Defense systems are under pressure. Energy prices continue to rise. Alliances are being tested. Investment patterns are shifting. And somewhere in Tehran tonight, planners are almost certainly preparing the next stage of the campaign. History rarely pauses for governments to catch up with the consequences of their decisions.